All right, so we were looking at this, the concept of worldliness or worldlikeness, and now I'm going to begin to go through some things in the scriptures that are characteristic of worldliness, what it means to be a worldly individual. And so there's different things that we can see, and if you go back and look at the definition of worldlikeness and what that means to be a worldly individual, we were focusing on and narrowing it down to sin, basically, is what it is. It's just different kinds of sins. And it's the idea of pursuing after and making the things of the world more important or in place of God and His will. And worldliness is a selfish attitude. Certainly, when you go back and look at a desire to pursue after something that would affect your covenant with God, that would affect your eternal outcome. There's a selfish act to that you're willing to disregard a holy God to somehow gratify yourself in some way that is not what He would desire for us to be or what we should be as His children. So tonight I'm going to be talking about being materialistic and what it means to be materialistic. And I think this is important, and one of the reasons these lessons are important to us is because they help us to find a balance in our own life where sometimes as Christians we will think that we are a certain way when we're really not, and either good or bad, right? We may think we're better than we really are, or we might think that we're worse than we really are. And so when it comes to the idea of being materialistic, there may be some out there who view the fact that they have a lot of things that it means that they're materialistic. Well, that's not necessarily true. Possessing things doesn't mean that you're a materialistic individual. A big part of it is, what is your attitude towards those things? How do you view it? It's like, well, are you materialistic because you own, I was reading this article. I thought this was funny, how people word things. And Kelly Clarkson, singer, she's getting divorced. And so in the article, a entertainment article, they were talking about how her and her husband were arguing over the properties. And the judge ruled that these two little properties of hers, she gets to keep them because she purchased it with her money. And so they said, and they used the word little. They said the first little property is a 7-bedroom house with 6 bathrooms. And I'm like, I think our definition of little is different than your definition of little. The other little house was a 6-bedroom house. And sitting, the one in Montana was sitting like on 40-something acres or something. I'm like, I think there's a confusion here on what we consider to be little. So somebody may think because they live in a 6-bedroom house that they're materialistic. Well, that's not necessarily true, right? It's not because you have things that you're a materialistic individual. If that's the case, what would you compare that to, or who would you compare it to? I mean, if possessing things make us materialistic, and it's like, well, compared to someone who has more than you or someone who has less than you. So someone who has more than me, they're materialistic. But someone who has less than me, well, then I guess I'm materialistic to them. Are we basing upon what another country possesses? You can go to some countries over there where they've got dirt floors and huts. I suppose they would look at us, and if we're living in a 1-bedroom house here in a low-income apartment complex, well, we could be materialistic then because you've got more than I have. So it's not about the quantity necessarily, about the quantity of your possessions. It goes back to as well your attitude toward those things and how you view them. And so when we're looking at this concept of being materialistic, the scriptures have some things to say about it. And I think it's important for us to study this and then be sure that we find out where we are and don't find ourselves on the wrong side of this. So let's begin then with some biblical examples of materialistic views. So let's go to Genesis, and this is one I think that's an easy one for us to understand. Genesis in chapter 13. Now maybe we'll look at it and we'll say, well, I just think Lot was being a wise individual, But I think there's more to it than that when you consider where Lot chooses to go and what the outcome of that decision is. So in Genesis in chapter 13, beginning over here in verse 6. And the land could not sustain them, and so this is Abraham and Lot. The land could not sustain them while dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to remain together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Now the Canaanite and the Perizzite were dwelling in the land. So Abram said to Lot, please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If to the left, then I'll go to the right. And if to the right, then I will go to the left. Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. So Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly and sinners against the Lord. Now think about that for a second. Certainly if you look at what Lot's doing, you can say, well, it's just a wise business decision, right? He sees the water, he sees the fertile valley. Why are you not going to choose that? It's just like common sense. Hey, I've got herds, I can go over here. I'm going to take possession of this. But if you consider the way this is worded, when you go back up to verse 7, we read after when they begin to make this decision, and there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Now the Canaanite and the Perizzite were dwelling then in the land. So he's bringing in some other people into the situation. What we find out is that Sodom is there. And according to what the scriptures teach here, Sodom did not become wicked after Lot moved there. It was already wicked before he moved there. So Lot was willing to put himself into a situation where there was already opportunity for wickedness because of the city of Sodom and the city of Gomorrah as well. But he looked at this land and he thought, well, hey, this is a land that, has everything that I need. Now again, on the surface, you may say, well, I think it's a wise business decision. If Abram's giving you the choice, although I would also consider the fact that Abram's taking care of him. This is his cousin. And I would think that you would want to honor the elder and say, no, you make the first choice. So maybe Lot's attitude is one of selfishness, of greed. And when you go back and look at the fact that he goes into this land and what eventually happens to him, I think there's some reason to question why he chose that in the first place. Was it just simply a wise business decision for his herdsmen, for the flock, so that he could prosper? Or was he just looking at the fact that, hey, I'm going to take hold of this opportunity because I really want to have this stuff. And I'll even put myself in harm's way. I'm going to put myself within reach of the city, eventually moving into the city, but I'm going to put myself in reach of a city that is one that is full of debauchery. So I think that's something that we can consider in a materialistic view to things. I think one of the key verses to this in looking at materialism in the Old Testament is Naboth and in 1 Kings in chapter 21, 1 through 16. So in Ahab is king, right? And Naboth has a vineyard. And when you go back and look at what transpires there, Ahab wants Naboth's vineyard, right? So he can expand his palace area in the garden. Well, in order to get what he wants, the outcome is he's going to have to kill off, or eventually going to kill off Naboth. Now, that wasn't his plan at the beginning, right? That wasn't his plan at the beginning. So take a look over in 1 Kings 21, beginning in verse 1. So now it came about after these things that Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard which was in Jezreel beside the palace of Ahab king of Samaria. Ahab spoke to Naboth saying, give me your vineyard that I may have it for a vegetable garden because it is close to my house, and I will give you a better vineyard that is in its place than it in its place. If you like, I will give you the price of it in money. But Naboth said to Ahab, the Lord forbid me that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers. So Ahab came into his house, and sullen and vexed because of the word which Naboth the Jezreelite had spoken to him. For he said, I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers. And he lay down on his bed and turned away his face and ate no food. But Jezebel his wife came to him and said to him, how is it that your spirit is so sullen that you are not eating food? So he said to her, because I spoke to Naboth the Jezreelite and said to him, give me your vineyard for money, or else if it pleases you, I will give you a vineyard in its place. But he said, I will not give you my vineyard. Jezebel his wife said to him, do you now reign over Israel? Arise, eat bread, and let your heart be joyful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. Now, let me stop here. Maybe you want to look at Ahab and say, well, he didn't actually do what's going to happen. Well, yeah, but he was more than willing to let his wife do whatever was necessary. Because you have to understand this, that Ahab knows that whatever she's going to do is not going to be legitimate. Because he's already tried the two legitimate ways to get it. Buy it or trade it. He's tried those. And he's been told by Naboth that I'm not going to give up my inheritance. Right? So Ahab has to understand that whatever Jezebel is going to do is not going to be something that is upright. So she wrote letters in Ahab's name and sealed them with his seal and sent letters to the elders and to the nobles who were living with Naboth in his city. Now she wrote in a letter saying, proclaim a fast and seat Naboth at the head of the people and see two worthless men before him and let them testify against him, saying, you curse God and the king, then take him out and stone him to death. And then as the story goes on, that's what they do. They end up killing him. All right, so this is materialism. This is a piece of property that Ahab wanted, but he couldn't get by legitimate means, and Naboth had every right not to sell it. So Jezebel, with permission of Ahab, puts together a scheme. Granted, Ahab doesn't know the scheme, but I think we can be reasonable in concluding that he knew it wasn't going to be an upright decision. He already tried that. So Naboth is killed, and in the end, Ahab gets the vineyard, gets the property for a vegetable garden, right? Because it was close to his house. Well, that's materialism. It's the idea that you're willing to take from somebody else something that you want, and you will use means that are ungodly to achieve that. All right, we have examples in the New Testament. Let me give you a couple examples here. Look in John chapter 12. When we look at Judas was certainly a man who was materialistic. And I'm not making a reference back to the 30 pieces of silver. Although you might want to argue that as a show of that. He was willing to betray Jesus for money. He preferred that. But there's another account of his life that demonstrates him being materialistic, and that is in John 12. Jesus, therefore, 6 days before the Passover, came to Bethany where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they made him a supper there, and Martha was serving, but Lazarus was one of those reclined at the table with him. Mary then took a pound of very costly perfume of pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples who was intending to betray him, said, why was the perfume not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor people? Now he said this not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief. And as he had the money box, he used to pilfer what was put into it. All right? So this is a man who's materialistic. He is willing to not only rob from the poor people, which is what he's been doing all along with the money box, taking money out of it, but in this situation, and think deeper into this, how everything is being set up. And it really gives you an idea of the power of materialism. When we're reading this, we're told that this is 6 days before the Passover, right? So Jesus is going to be betrayed. They came to Bethany where Lazarus was. whom, what? Jesus had raised from the dead. So they made him a supper there, and Martha was serving, but Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him. Now, I want you to think about this setup, this scenario. Judas is fully aware that Jesus resurrected Lazarus from the dead. Lazarus' sisters were Martha and Mary. So you have this playing out before us in such a way as to show just how bad Judas was. It wasn't if Judas was a guy who didn't comprehend the works of Jesus. I just don't understand who he is. I haven't seen anything he's done. The fact that this begins with Lazarus being there in that house, and this is after he's been resurrected, and Judas knows this, Judas is even still willing to betray the Christ who resurrected Lazarus. How bad do you have to be to know that he called him forth from the tomb after he's been there for 3 days and he stinks? They're all saying this. Judas knows this, yet he's still willing to argue that the perfume that was being used, that Lazarus' sister was using on Jesus, which would be a noble thing to do. Why? Because he had resurrected her brother, and two, it was a preparation for him. That was an honorable thing for him to do, for her to do. So you have a juxtaposition here. Here is juxtaposed against a Mary, and what she's doing is the thief Judas. The one who is not only a thief, but who's willing to give up, betray, and it even says this, that he's going to do that. Betray the one who raised Lazarus from the dead. And the fact that this moves into the argument of him saying, well, we could have sold that, when in fact all he wanted to do was steal it, shows you a glimpse of what materialism looks like. It's when that money and what Lazarus or what Judas could do with it was more important than what Jesus had done. More important than what Mary was doing to Jesus, who had resurrected her brother. See, it's not just the fact that, Lazarus, his argument could have been about an argument, right? It could have been about an argument. It could have been an argument that was valid, but stopped and said, Judas, I understand, but what she's doing is a needed thing. That would have been the end of it. But the argument that he gave was not an argument of truth. That's not what he was concerned about. What he was really concerned about was, I'm not going to get the money. And I could use that money to, I don't know what he put, maybe he can go buy his summer home. I don't know what he was going to do with this stuff. So I think that's a great example of one who is materialistic. Acts chapter 5 and verses 1 through 11, we have the story of Ananias and Sapphira. I think you see materialism there. And the argument with Ananias and Sapphira, if you remember this account, Barnabas sells his property and gives all the money to the apostles. Well, Ananias and Sapphira, it seems that they want to be considered as kind of those noble people who do the same thing. So what they do is they sell a piece of property. But instead of giving all of it to the apostles, which they didn't have to do, they only gave part of it. But they appeared or left the idea that they were giving all of it. And if you go back and look at the argument, remember what Peter says to him? He says, hey, while it was your land, it was yours to do what you wanted to. And even when you sold it, there was nothing wrong with you owning the land, and there was nothing wrong with you selling it and keeping the money for yourself. That's not materialism. What went from being something legitimate to materialistic is when you decided to lie to God, lie to the Holy Spirit by keeping back some of the money for your own desires, and then showing yourself or trying to appear to be people who were noble and as Barnabas and selling your property and giving it so you could help those who are in need. That is a materialistic attitude because it was about selfishness, right? It was about what they wanted to appear to be and the fact that they're like, hey, that land's worth a lot of money. And so it's like, and I think the argument is really great when Peter says, well, you didn't even have to give any of it. It was yours to do what you wanted to. So it was their attitude towards it. Well, we want to give something. but we don't want to give all of it, but we want to look like we're giving all of it. Well, that's a problem. And that's materialism, the image that they are showing there. So I think these are some good examples that we can look at, and there's many more that you can look at and see as being those which are a materialistic attitude. Now, in the second point, I want to take a look at what Jesus has to say about it. I'm going to just share with you a couple of examples that Jesus gives, and for time's sake, I'm not going to read through all of these, so just jot these down so you can have this for reference. So Jesus teaches concerning materialism. Now, I'll say this. I can't say that what Jesus was doing was saying, hey, let me give you a lesson on materialism. But I believe he was showing examples where people were more given over to wanting their possessions than following him. And that is materialism. It is when you're replacing your faith in God and your trust in him with your own possessions and making them more important. In fact, it is referred to even as idolatry. So you have the rich fool, Luke chapter 12, 16 through 21. You know, a man who stores up all of his goods, right? And then he's going to take his ease because now he's got everything he wants. But he's a fool because tonight your soul is required of you. And what's going to happen? So this man looked at everything that he had achieved and he felt pretty good about it. You know, yeah, look at all this stuff I've got. And I'm just going to take my ease and I'm going to just sit back and enjoy all my prosperity. And then he says, yeah, but the thing was, you didn't give your life to God. Tonight your soul is required of you, not your possessions. Because when you die, your possessions are going to stay here and they're going to be left to someone else. Tonight, your soul is required of you. What is the condition of that? Well, obviously from the man's mindset of looking at all of his possessions and acquiring this bounty that he had, that was more important to him than the condition of his soul. That is a good definition of materialism. You have the rich young ruler. We're all familiar with that in Luke chapter 18. Jesus talked about that in 18 through 25. The idea that he has much possessions. He wants to know what to inherit eternal life. What must he do? And Jesus tells him to sell all that you have and give it to the poor and follow me. And I've always argued, I don't think that Jesus was literally telling him to do that. What he was trying to tell him to do is whatever it is that's keeping you from following me, you need to let go of that. And we know that it was the money that was keeping him from following Jesus, because when Jesus told him to do that, he went away deeply grieved because he had much possessions. So he was like, he didn't want it. And here's one of those questions. It's similar to Judas. The question was, what must I do to inherit eternal life? He wasn't willing to give up his possessions for that. He was not willing to replace his possessions with following God. Thus, he's a materialistic individual. His material possessions are of greater value to him than the poor and following Jesus. And then one other one you can consider is Luke with the Luke chapter 16, 9 through 21, or 19 through 21. That's actually much more than that, but specifically those verses. The rich man and Lazarus. You know, the rich man was very materialistic. You look back at his life and all that he had, all the gain that he had, and he allowed poor Lazarus to sit outside of his gate and suffer and be hungry, and the dogs were licking his sores, and his possessions were more important to him. And what was the outcome of that? Well, when he's in torments and he's asking Abraham to send over Lazarus to intercede with him, Abraham tells him, hey, in your life you had your good things. But the good thing that he didn't pursue after was God's grace, God's love. How do you know that? Because he's in torments. If he would have been pursuing after the things of God, he would be where Lazarus is, in the bosom of Abraham. He's not. So his focus was not on the helping and being a follower of God. His focus was on his possessions. Now, you can even go back and look at how he was treating Lazarus. The fact that he wasn't even trying to help him. The location of Lazarus is important to this argument as well. It's not as if the man was like, I never saw this homeless dude. I never go downtown Phoenix. I never see the homeless people downtown. I live over in Sun City West, and I don't see somebody letting, they're not sitting in front of my door. So the scenario unfolds with, you couldn't miss him, mister. You walked by him every day. You saw his plight. And you dined. You drank. You had all that you needed and more. And you were unwilling to even give what? The crumbs from the table. Just give him something to eat. You wouldn't even do that. So, again, Jesus talks about this kind of mindset. And when you go back and you look at the rich fool, the rich man and Lazarus, and then the rich young ruler, the end of each one of those individuals is not good. It's not good. The rich man ends up in torments. The rich fool, his soul is required of him that night, and he's not prepared to give it. And the rich young ruler certainly doesn't seem to be one who's going to inherit eternal life, because when Jesus told him what to do to inherit it, he walked away grieved. So the outcome of materialism is not good for the people who hold their possessions in higher regard than God. All right, let me see. What do we got here? Okay, I got a few minutes. All right, so let me share with you now some ways to overcome materialism in our lives. It's not a difficult thing. I mean, really, it's something that I think we can understand and actually put into practice. Over in 1 Timothy chapter 6, beginning in verse 6. Paul says, but godliness actually is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. For we have brought nothing into this world, so we cannot take anything out either. Now he's talking about wealth here. He says, if we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful desires, which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil, and some longing for it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. But flee from these things, you man of God, and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, perseverance, and gentleness. So the fact that we're told in verse 7, we brought nothing into this world, so we cannot take anything out either, is telling us that whatever possessions we have are temporary anyway. And so we need to understand that there are things that are of far greater value than material things. One of those things is, at the top of the list, your soul. What would you give in exchange for your soul? Would you take the whole world and give up your soul? Because in the end, according to 1 John chapter 2, the world is going to be destroyed. So whatever you're going to trade your soul for, you're going to lose anyway. But the outcome and destiny of your soul is an eternal choice you're making. So would I be willing to give up an eternal dwelling with God for a temporary material thing here? Some are. Some are willing to do that. And so we need to just sit back and say, all right, I can't go down that path of putting my possessions at the forefront of my life, because it could cost me my soul. And that's what the warning is here. If you have the love of money and you pursue after those things, you can find yourself losing your salvation. And people have done it. They get so caught up in trying to want, bigger houses and more things. And again, it's not about owning, it's not about the possessions themselves. Everybody, I can tell you this, that if this is true, which I believe it is, in verse 8, if we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. Nobody sitting here has just that. Everybody sitting here has far more than that. So if we're trying to determine materialism based upon the amount, we're missing the point. It's not the amount of possessions you have. It's the attitude towards those possessions, how you view them as compared to the value you place on your soul and what God wants you to be. So everybody then could be considered to have far more than food and covering. And if we're doing amount, then I guess we're all materialistic. But the degree of what we possess is not the point, because I can have an abundance and still not allow those things to get in the way of my faith with God and my service to God. They don't have to. And God never instructs us to live a destitute, poor life. He says, be content with food and covering, but that's not what he just simply blesses us with, just simply that. He gives us far more than that, and everybody can testify to that. So again, material things are temporary. And so we need to just be sure that whatever it is that we possess, we understand that whether I live in a big house or a small house, eventually all of that's going to be gone. What's going to go on into eternity is my soul. Riches do not always bring contentment and happiness. You know, we went through and we studied through Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes, Solomon was very clear that all the possessions you can amass in this world do not bring about happiness and contentment. So if I realize that, then I say, well, okay, there's only so much that these things are going to do. They're useful tools. There are things that we possess that are tools. There are things that we possess that are for enjoyment, right? There are things that we possess because we just like to look at them. See, this is me personally. I tell, not that. Let me finish it. Before you laugh, let me finish. So when Teresa and I go someplace, we went to, I don't know, we was at someplace and here in town somewhere, and they got all these tchotchkes for sale. You know what tchotchkes are? Tchotchkes are anything that you buy that represents where you were. Like little Eiffel Towers because you went to Paris, or keychains from any truck stop you stopped at along the road, or some bumper sticker or some little placard because you stayed in some place. I don't buy those things. I'm like, why do I want to fill my house up with all that stuff? You have all this stuff. What do you do with it? It's like if I don't have it, I can't remember that I went there. Oh, look, I remember when I went to that restaurant. I got a napkin or something like that. I don't know. But that's me personally. Some people like that kind of stuff. So sometimes we have possessions just because we like to look at them. We're like, oh, yeah, it's fun. Look at the curio cabinets people had in their homes. Just full of all kinds of stuff, right? Hey, that's fine. I mean, I'm not saying it's wrong. It's just everybody's different. If that becomes the focus of your life, then there's a problem with that. If there's things that you have that are to enjoy, things that you use as tools, I think every guy out there probably has more tools than he actually needs or that he ever uses. Sometimes we buy one tool that we use once, and then it just sits around forever. And of course, we know that one day we'll use it again, or somebody will want to borrow it. So, because we're not going to sell the thing, we're going to hold on to it for a while until it's outdated and nobody wants to use it anymore. But again, it's not about what you possess so much as it about your attitude towards those things. And if I make those things of the greatest importance in my life, then I'm going to run into a problem. And if I feel like I can't be content or happy without those things, then I'm really facing a problem, because now I'm not content with what God gives me. I have to be content only when I have possessions. And this is what we know about possessions. What was exciting today is old tomorrow. And so you need to get the newer, the bigger, the better. And so you can oh, it's exciting. I'm excited. I got something new. And again, I'm not saying I'm not saying getting new things is wrong either. I'm getting a new phone. Okay, I'm materialistic. Sorry, no, I'm getting a new phone, but I use my phone as a tool. I use it all the time for a tool. Teresa, she's still hanging on to, I think it's a flip phone. I'm not sure what it is. It's probably a dial-up in a bag, right? She's like, hey, I got my Motorola right here in my bag. So, but I'm like, well, I use my stuff as a tool, so I'm going to upgrade to a newer one. So I use it for those things. Nothing wrong with that. But if you're like, well, I really want to put some contribution into the plate this week, but I'm planning on going on a vacation instead, then you might want to consider whether or not you are actually being materialistic. Materialism can cause us to be unfruitful, and we could lose our salvation. Matthew chapter 13. I just got a couple more here, and then we'll conclude. Matthew chapter 13. We can become unfruitful in the kingdom because when materialism takes hold, then our pursuit is after those things. And when you're pursuing after material things, it limits your time in producing spiritual things because you're pursuing after all these material things. In Matthew in chapter 13, down in verse 22, and the one on whom seed was sown among the thorns, this is a man who hears the word, and the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. So if wealth is our thing, materialism is our thing, then the word will eventually be choked out of our life, because you can't pursue after the material things of the world and try to stick a little bit of Jesus into your life while you're doing that. You will just become unfruitful. And so there's a danger. So we need to realize that if I'm going to be fruitful, then I need to be sure that Christ and his kingdom and his work is foremost in my life. All right, so in going back and looking at worldliness and materialism certainly is one of those things, we need to be sure that we are seeking to bring glory to God in all that we're doing, and realize that although there is advantages and it's nice to have things, nothing wrong with that, to have a house, to have clothes, to have food, the necessities, but even an abundance of those things, nothing wrong with that. But consider in your own life whether those things are interfering with your work for God. And if those things are interfering with your work for God, then you might want to consider if that should be something you should let go of, because in order for you to maintain that thing, it makes you unfruitful or unproductive in God's kingdom, then let it go. Let it go, whatever it might be, because you're trying to maintain something that is eventually going to be gone anyway, or that you will be gone and it'll still be here, but it won't be of any good to you at the expense of your salvation. So